Hello and welcome back to Off the Deaton Path. I'm your host, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we welcome you to this podcast for the week of June 19th, 2025. We are coming to you this week from the History and Memory Division here at the Georgia Historical Society on the 15th floor of the Jepson House overlooking beautiful Forsyth Park in downtown Savannah. My very special guest this week is author and historian Robert Cohen, who joins me to talk about his new book on desegregation at the University of Georgia and the ways it has been publicly remembered. Robert Cohen is a professor of history and social studies at New York University's Steinhardt School of Culture, Education, and Human Development. He is an affiliated member of NYU's History Department. His historical scholarship focuses on politics, higher education, and social protest in 20th century America. His social studies work links middle and high school teachers with the recent advances in historical scholarship and develops curriculum aimed at teaching their students to explore history as a critical discipline and one that is characterized by intense and exciting debate. Robert received his BA from the State University of New York at Buffalo, a master's in education from SUNY Buffalo, and a master's and PhD in history from the University of California at Berkeley, where he studied with renowned historian Leon Litwack. He has taught at NYU since 1998, previously taught at the University of Georgia and the University of Toledo. Robert is the author of numerous books, including co-editing a volume entitled With Liberty and Justice for All, The Constitution in the Classroom, published by Oxford University Press in 2022. Howard Zinn's Southern Diary, Sit-ins, Civil Rights, and Black Women's Student Activism, published by the University of Georgia Press in 2018. An edited volume entitled Teaching U.S. History, Dialogues Among Social Studies Teachers and Historians, published by Routledge in 2010. When the Old Left Was Young, Student Radicals and America's First Mass Student Movement, 1929 to 1941, published by Oxford University Press in 1993. His latest book, and the one he is here to talk about with me today, is entitled Confronting Jim Crow, Race, Memory, and the University of Georgia in the 20th Century, published by the University of North Carolina Press on August 27, 2024. This book has won a 2025 Lillian Smith Award, which is sponsored by the Southern Regional Council, the University of Georgia Libraries, DeKalb County Public Libraries, Georgia Center for the Book, and Piedmont University. The Lillian Smith Award, and I quote here, represents outstanding creative achievements worthy of recognition because of their literary merit, moral vision, and honest representation of the South, its people, problems, and promises. The award honors those authors who, through their writing, carry on Smith's legacy of elucidating the condition of racial and social inequity and proposing a vision of justice and human understanding that represents the ideals of a racially just society. Unquote. My conversation with Robert Cohen begins now. Robert Cohen, welcome to our podcast.
Hey, nice to be here.
You have written an important book called Confronting Jim Crow, Race, Memory, and the University of Georgia in the 20th Century. It's a big book. There you cover a lot of ground. But one of the things I was immediately struck with is you say that UGA served as a, quote, leadership academy for Jim Crow Georgia before 1961, which is when integration began. Talk a little bit for our listeners here what that means, a leadership academy for Jim Crow Georgia.
Well, if you look at the most important educational and political leaders in the state of Georgia during the Jim Crow era, many of them, the most influential people, senators and governors and presidents of the University of Georgia, came through the University of Georgia, either as undergraduates or law students or both. And so the University of Georgia essentially, I think, helped to shape the kind of segregationist power elite of Georgia. That, there had been scholarship that in the social sciences since the 1920s and 30s that really kind of undermined and refuted assumptions about white supremacy. And yet you find that the students coming into the University of Georgia and the graduates seem like they did not get exposed to it. And so essentially, and of course, the view of history that they got in their history courses was old Dunningite School of Reconstruction, whose lessons were really kind of this racist notion that blacks should not be allowed to participate in politics, that that was a nightmare scenario, giving the former slaves power, political power or the vote, and all these sort of really racist assumptions were not challenged. And so what you found was, and by the way, that's the curriculum. Then you have the extracurriculum, which was all white athletic teams, all white fraternities and sororities, social life that just kind of reinforced assumptions about white supremacy. And so what you found, people like the Talmadges, Richard Russell, really important political figures, and that were important in the U.S. Senate, the governors like Vandiver, they all came through the University of Georgia. And so what you saw was there wasn't any intervention on the part of the university to disrupt racist assumptions. And faculty members who did try to do that were really repressed or punished for it, and ended up
Hmm.
many leaving or becoming really quiet. So there wasn't really academic freedom. And so what I would just say is that it's a kind of a failure of the university as an educational institution. And by the way, my fear is a lot what's going on today with the Trump and DeSantis administrations at the DC and nationally and in Florida is that by barring the critical discussion of race, we're going back to that kind of era where there isn't educational intervention on behalf of a more diverse and inclusive society. And so this is a very serious, so I think that this is a historical study, but it has implications for where we are today in thinking about, oh, if you want to get rid of multicultural education, you want to think that discussing African American history, slavery, Jim Crow is too divisive. Well, that just promotes ignorance. And by the way, where you saw that kind of culminating was how some of the white students at Georgia responded to desegregation in 1961, where there was a segregationist riot aligned with the Klan. So this is something you wouldn't expect from a highly educated elite. So I think there's a real, a failure of the university as an educational institution to promote critical thinking and to be, with it with what's going on in the social sciences, having people be up to date. And so essentially what I'm saying is it functioned as a kind of social and political, the University of Georgia functioned as kind of a social and political leadership academy for the segregationist elite of Georgia, which was very sad because it meant that to change that structure and the undemocratic uh, and racist structure, you had to go outside of the university. That the great reformers who promoted change were not UGA graduates for the most part. They were people outside of the university, particularly from the Black community in Atlanta. And it's good that they did what they did, but it's kind of sad that, say, at a time when other universities were involved in promoting racial inclusive ideas, that the University of Georgia was not open to doing that. And the irony of this was that a lot of the fears was, well, if you integrated, if you change that ethos, it would mean the decline of the university. When really it's the opposite. The university became a much better, stronger, I think, a great university in a lot of ways, intellectually and academically, once this kind of parochialism was, when the color line was shattered, you got now, instead of just getting sort of the best regional people, or supposedly the best, you got the best people nationally across racial lines. It became possible to have a much better university. And by the way, just to give you two kind of examples of this, one cultural. In 1959, the Jazz Club of University of Georgia was inviting the Dave Brubeck quartet, the jazz club that was inviting this great jazz band, and they didn't realize that the bass player, Eugene Wright, was black. And when they did, they disinvited them,
Mm.
right? So think, what does that mean about the cultural life of the campus if if you can't bring somebody in, an interracial band because one member of the band is black? And I think about this more in an academic way. Like, who was the greatest social scientist and historian in Georgia during the Jim Crow era? Well, W.B. Du Bois, when he was
Hmm.
and as far as I know, he never set foot on the University of Georgia campus.
Hmm.
The powerhouse of Georgia in that some of that era. E. Merton Coulter, whose work is pretty much so infected by white supremacy that it's of limited value. Nobody really is using Coulter the way that they use
Hmm.
the voice today. So there's that intellectual piece. And one last thing, which just to show this is a national problem, not just a Georgia problem. When I came to Georgia in October to talk about the book, it was football season, so I started with a football story, which actually isn't in the book because it's NYU connected. In 1929, the University of Georgia was scheduled to play a game against NYU, football team, in Yankee Stadium. Now, this is kind of amazing to think about these days because NYU doesn't even have a football team anymore, and Georgia has a great football team tradition, right? But in 1929, it was a little bit reversed. In 1929, NYU had a really good team, and they were scheduled to play a game against Georgia in Yankee Stadium, which is huge, a huge venue. But in order to play, because Georgia had this Jim Crow tradition, they wanted NYU to bench their star black player, a fullback and sometimes quarterback named Dave Meyer. And the two coaches, NYU's coach and Georgia's coach, came to an agreement, like they call it a gentleman's agreement, ironically, that was the term, to bench him, right? And so think about that, right? How can you have a fair contest if one team's going to not be meritocratic, but say we're not going to let this person play because of the color line, and just to contrast this, so there was northern, in this case, complicity in this, right? But what was different was at NYU, this led to a lot of protest, and New York City, there was a lot of objections to what NYU had agreed to. And there's a columnist named Haywood Broun in the local press who called NYU's coach the gutless coach of a gutless college for going along with it.
Mm.
And there were student letters and petitions against it. The game went forward anyway. But on the Georgia side, there were no protests at all. See, so I'm saying the issue about segregation and racism is a national problem, but at least in NYU, there was some freedom to, express dissent. Whereas in Georgia, the social pressure was that nobody objected at all.
Hmm.
And ended up winning the game. But the point is, it's just such I think, a very vivid illustration of how corrupting Jim Crow was in terms of making the university a place of excellence. Contrast that with what happened, in 1980 when the university had desegregated and you had Herschel Walker helping the university win its first undisputed national title.
Hmm.
So being meritocratic is liberating for the university. It makes it better, rather than have this sort of depressing and I think kind of, I don't know, it's just a very graphic illustration of what was so corrupt about the Jim Crow system. So that too is thinking about the fact that you would not think of this as problematic, right? All these people coming out of the political elite and economic and educational elite not being, uh, encouraged to think critically about this is really sad. And I think that's what I meant by it as kind of a leadership academy for the Jim Crow Georgia.
So we know that Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 hands down the decision that public education is no longer constitutional if it's segregated. And we know that the white South engaged in massive resistance. All politicians sort of in lockstep, from the Capitol in D.C. to state capitals all across the South, opposed integration, and so they would shut public schools down rather than integrate. But by court order in January 1961, the University of Georgia integrated. Walk us through, if you will. You won't have to tell the whole story, but you do in this book talk about it, and you break it down. Of two African Americans were enrolled at the university in January, Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter. And tell us what happened after they were enrolled.
Okay, well, it was a court case, Holmes versus Danner, that the district court, W.A. Boodle, ruled in favor of the black students being admitted by court order. The University of Georgia opposed it all the way, and made really kind of it's just a very I don't know, a dishonest, I would say, a case that there was no room at the university for that. They weren't racially discriminatory. It was sort of like an accident that never been a black student at the University of Georgia. They just didn't have any room.
Right.
And in the court uh, case, and by the way, it was kind of like a black all-star team legally. Constance Baker Motley, who became a federal judge, Horace Ward, who became a federal judge, Vernon Jordan, who became very prominent advisor to Bill Clinton. I mean, it's just an incredible legal team, and they found evidence that students who had applied later, especially there's a young female student who had applied just as late as Hamilton and Charlene had been admitted, a white student. So it really showed that it was nonsense. But what was, I think, the most striking and depressing moment in the hearing was when University President O.C. Hatterhold testified under oath that the university did not discriminate racially. And that was just really perjurious. I mean, basically what happened was that because of Brown, he couldn't say that they had that kind of policy because then they would lose the case. So he
Hmm.
tried to make it like they didn't have such a policy. And so the court ordered them to be admitted. Now, by the way, we're going to back up for a second. They were not the first African American students to try to apply to University of Georgia. The first one who had mentioned his name, he'd been on the legal team of
Hmm.
Hamilton, was Horace Ward. He had applied to law school in 1950. And the university just strung him along endlessly. It was a 6-year struggle, and eventually he lost. He began before Brown. He had been encouraged by this Texas case, Sweat versus Painter, which we could talk about, but in 1950. But the point is that he never was admitted. They did all kinds of ridiculous things. They changed the admissions procedure. They said you had to have a recommendation from an alum of the University of Georgia and a local judge. They changed and by the way, there was a professor named James Lenoir in the law school who resigned because he thought this had been so corrupting that they would change the admissions policies just to keep this black student out. And his name was Horace Ward. He later got his degree at Northwestern Law School. And later he joked that he became a federal district judge appointed by President Carter. And he joked that he should be the best lawyer in the state because he spent 6 years trying to get into law school and 3 years trying to get out. That one. But yeah, it was a very long legal battle. And during their first week, Charlene and Hamilton, there was a segregationist riot outside of her dormitory, Central Myers, and the students, had a big banner, said "Nigger go home." I mean, and almost over 1,000 students were involved in it. Threw firecrackers, broke windows. The Klan participated. It was a very shameful moment, and one thing that was positive was that it outraged the faculty, who finally found their voice. And they had said nothing during the Horace Ward case, but they were really upset about this riot. Like the idea that the Georgia students would behave this way was really embarrassing. And they were blasted from coast to coast by the media, and the faculty were very upset and petitioned that they should admit, because with the riot, by the way, I didn't mention that instead of initially suspending the students who rioted, they suspended Hunter and Holmes, quote unquote, for their own safety, and which was really dubious to begin with because the suspension came after the riot had ended. But the fact that you'd had the students doing that was really, that there were so many students who would behave in this way was a sign again of what I was talking about earlier, the failure of the university, to educate people. Because again, it's based on this fear of change and racism. And in fact, both of these students, think about it, there were 7,000 students at Georgia. There are two black students. Your chances of running into them or being in a class with them are pretty small, even
Hmm.
if so what were people so upset about? This fear of change and what they weren't qualified? I mean, Hamilton was Phi Beta Kappa, and he later on became a surgeon and a medical school dean. Charlene later Charlene Hunter Galt, became a world famous journalist, right? So, on the New York Times, PBS, National Public Radio, these folks were really well qualified. So, and by the way, that's again to make it current. One of the things that disturbs me about what's been going on with the Trumpism and all that is this thing about DEI hires, which really just is chilling to me because it's the same notion that, oh, black people couldn't be qualified to go to school with white people. It's that same, it just really brings that to mind. So I just think again, there was this failure of education that you could end up where you have these two very, highly qualified students being admitted, and how are they being received? So it's a very depressing story. And then it goes on that Hamilton was he found the atmosphere so cold, even after the riot had ended. Some of the students decided, well, the way to respond is kind of psychological warfare. Maybe if we were unfriendly, it could be so, because college is not just going to classes, it's also having friends.
Hmm.
And Hamilton didn't make a single friend in all his years at Georgia. And he'd go on the weekend back to his home community in Black Atlanta. Charlene was able to make some friends, and it was a bit better for her. She had lived on campus, he never did. But, it was really, she ended up having stomach problems, like almost like a kind of ulcer type situation because of, college is not supposed to be just going to classes, right? You want to have a social life. And she talked about one day she realized, like after 2 days, she looked in the mirror in her apartment and she realized, or in her dorm room, that she hadn't spoken to anybody in 2 days.
Mm.
Somebody who's very friendly and loquacious and outgoing. So it's a very sad story in that way. And I think there's some really important lessons for us to think about today. Not to say we haven't made progress or anything, but just the danger of being parochial and not being open to thinking about people who come from different backgrounds than you. And the other thing I would just want to add to is that one of the sad parts, to me, one of the saddest parts about the integration struggle was that the leadership of Georgia, again, having been trained and socialized into segregation, did not come to grips with what had been wrong with the system. The fact that you were charging, people at Georgia in the black community pay taxes, but they can't go to the best state supported public institution in the state, right? So, and the fact that it's unfair, and it's also hurting white Georgians who never get to go to school with black classmates. That wasn't the idea. Wasn't that integration was right. It was more like it was forced upon us
Mm.
by these overbearing federal courts. So even when Governor Vandiver when to his credit, he didn't go on for massive resistance after this. He was willing to kind of obey the court order and keep the university open. There was some talk about would we rather close the university rather than integrate it, and that happened in other states. It happened even in Virginia, the whole county, Prince Edward County, that closed their public schools rather than integrate it. So to his credit, Governor Vandiver didn't do that, but while going along with it, he objected to what the courts were doing. He tried to have a provision that would give, if people who didn't want to go to school, they could go someplace else. There's sort of other options, right? So the leadership, even the best people at the university, like Dean Tate, who I think in some ways was really heroic in standing up against racial violence, and during the riot, he was trying to stop it, and he got actually injured. So a very admirable character, but not even he will come out and say, look, this is just, this is right, this is better for the university. So nobody ever said that. And I think that legacy is that now, even today, you can honor the first black students, and they do, Charlene Hamilton and later Mary Frances Early, the first black graduate student, but not really talking about like what, why you had to be so heroic to come there in the first place. You
Hmm.
know, so that to me is a real, and by the way, I don't mean to just single out Georgia in this regard. It's true nationally, that there's never been, for white America has never really come to grips with its mistreatment and discrimination against African American and other groups that were oppressed. So I do think, I don't want to just make it like Georgia is unique, but I do think that that failure in 1961 to admit that this had been wrong all along is really, one of the unfortunate legacies. And by the way, the faculty, I've praised them and I do in the book for finally saying that we need to keep the university open rather than close it, and we need to have Hamilton and Holmes reinstated. But they never really came to grips with this as a curricular matter. Like ask themselves, like we might today, why, what was wrong with the university's curriculum and teaching and learning process that students would riot like this, that they would be so opposed? And in other words, what way could we change the curriculum that would better educate our students so that they could be more inclusive and open to people who are, across racial lines? That conversation really never occurred. And I think that's true educationally and it's true politically. And it's part of the reason why I think these problems still fester.
And one of the most, to use the word unusual, but also I think really enlightening parts of your book is when you're talking about the students and what they thought. You have a chapter called 2468, We Don't Want to Integrate, which is, of course, based upon an article you published in the Georgia Historical Quarterly. gosh, now almost 30 years ago, and you expand on it here and have a postscript here, in which you were able to examine almost in real time what students who were enrolled, white students who were enrolled at the University of Georgia in January 1961, thought about what was happening on their campus. The obviously no internet, no social media for everybody in the world to kind of put their opinions out there, but you found an extraordinary group of essays in the university archives that had been put there by a university professor in 1961, and they had lain there for 35 years or so before you tapped into these. Tell the story about the Math 254 class and those essays.
Right. Yeah, those are just a gold. That's really, in a way, when I started this research, almost 30 years ago, was because of that collection. I was like thinking about how do I teach this to my students, as I was a professor at University of Georgia teaching future teachers, and I was really interested in how can I teach the students about the integration of the university. And what happened was I stumbled upon these collection of these letters. That means not more or less they were statements that had been written for Thomas Brahana's calculus class. This was a week after the segregationist riot, and he was supposed to give an exam in calculus, but he saw the students were too upset. So asked them instead to write what they thought about the integration of the university and the integration crisis. And what was interesting about it was that he knew that it was the reason he did it was he wanted to show the students that they could express themselves, openly about this without violence, right? He wanted them to see that we can talk about this. And so he had them write these essays. Now, Brahana was one of the people in the AUP chapter who helped to organize the meeting in the chapel that led to the petition to reinstate, the faculty petition to reinstate Hamilton and Charlene. So the students kind of knew that he was on the progressive side of these issues. But on the other hand, it's not a social science course, it's a math course. So they knew they weren't going to really be hurt by what they said if he didn't agree with it, because their grade is about how they do in calculus. So it's a pretty good collection. And what he did was he collected them and put them in the, I guess he read them, but he put them in there and never did anything with them. And no, historians usually are interested in what goes on. What's the governor doing? What's the president doing? But in a way, it's really more important what the students think, because
Mm.
they're the ones who are going to be living with and near and in classes with these first two black students. So I thought they were really important sources. And what they show is that there's a lot of racial mythology, a lot of white supremacist assumptions, some things that are almost just you can't even believe that educated students could think this way, like that blacks have thicker skull sizes, or that they didn't come through evolution as far as whites did, or that there's all this myths about black criminality. And there were some students who didn't fit with that, so not everybody was there, but there was just so much of this that it really, again, kind of reinforced the notion like they weren't learning about race and modern social science assumptions about race in their classes. And so I was thinking, like, where were they getting their ideas from? It's kind of intellectual history of these students. And most of them got their ideas from the white side of the color line. That is their families, their local communities, right? And so it just reinforced their assumptions, their prejudices. And it was really clear that the only African Americans most interacted with were servants. So they assumed, well, blacks don't want to go to school with us. The servants were not in a position, in terms of power, to tell the whites who employed them what they really thought. So they really thought they understood blacks, but they never met black college students or black teachers or black professors. So they had no idea. So these letters really were illuminating to me. And by the way, I just want to say something else, that a lot of times the way that the story of segregationists is told is, pot-bellied, brutal sheriffs, Southern lawmen like Bill Connor or somebody who are beating people over the head and they're just demonized. But you never get to think, well, what did ordinary Southern whites think? Educated, what did they think about these issues? So it was a way to kind of look at their ideas and go beyond these sort of, stereotypes about people and to see, what they were thinking, how they were thinking, and where they got their ideas from. And so it really seemed to me that there was this sort of majority groupthink that most students had because of their background, and they were not willing to really rethink. Nobody was very few people, teachers had kind of asked them to rethink their ideas, but there were a few who were opposed to segregation. And some would say, like a few would say, like, I am a working class student. I have to work after school to go to university. I don't want the university closed down to keep segregated. And to me, that's more important than the issue. And some would just say, look, this is really, the system is wrong. That we should, if somebody's qualified across racial lines, they should be able to come. There's only a few students. But the thing about that, Sam, is that what that also shows is that the students, there were some students who were dissenting, but they were afraid to say that publicly. They could say it in these essay, but they
Mm.
didn't say it publicly because there's so much peer pressure that if you so much as walked Charlene across campus, you could be like, ostracize yourself from your sorority or something. So there was a lot of peer pressure on the students, not those few dissident students, not to express themselves. So I think those essays, to me, are a good lesson for us about why we need a more inclusive and multicultural version of education where they can learn about people from other races. They could learn some Black history. They could learn about some civil rights history. I mean, they were saying things like the NAACP is the National Association, not for colored people, but the Communist Party. Now, if you know anything about about civil rights organizations, the NAACP is the oldest. It had a very legalistic view, very middle class view of mostly in politics. It was not radical or it did not
Hmm.
do direct action. So to act like these are ultra radical communists is absurd. And yet several of the students would say that because they didn't learn anything about the NAACP in their classes. And so they were really ignorant of the civil rights movement, Black history, and a lot of this, it just bred this fear. And really, sometimes change can be, terrifying, but sometimes change is good. And again, as I said earlier, I think the change that they were going through was really, good for the university. Some of them later on, many of them would later on realize that, but way too late to have done anything about that during this crisis.
Hmm.
These sources, I think show us a lot about the problems, the failures of education, and gives us some things to think about today that we need to have our educational institutions, you know, bring students up to date about the history, social science, and the sciences, what they're telling us about race and, interracial interaction.
One of the things that really resonated was you made clear that these students themselves, these white students writing these essays, most of them, with very few exceptions, saw themselves as the victims, not Holmes and Hunter. That segregation, instead of something that was opening the desegregation, instead of something that was opening doors, it was being shoved down their throats. It was happening to them. It was happening to their university. So instead of seeing this as a moment of racial inclusivity, they saw it as sort of perpetuating the idea that white people are the victims of this.
Right, and that has to do too with the that was reflected how the political and educational leaders were talking about this,
Hmm.
right? We
Hmm.
already saw that the university had resisted to the bitter end in court, right? So if your dean or your president is really acting as if this is we're losing a whole way of life here, and the political leaders are saying the same thing, then you're going to have you're likely as a student going to react that way too. You feel like, oh, it's these overbearing these federal courts. They're the ones who are forcing this on us, right? They're disrupting our whole way of life because this big government is just forcing something down our throats.
Mm.
And so that was the dominant uh, way of thinking about this, not just among the students, but among the educational leaders of Georgia and the political elite. So that's kind of what that's an important point that you're raising. That's part of the failure I'm talking about. That like, what lessons did you learn about this? And the way this is, the continuity of this is that even to this day, a lot of people won't now you won't say explicitly that something that's really racially, biased, but you're really lambasting big government. Well, what did big government do that so alienated the right wing in this country? Well, part of what it did was exactly what you're talking about, that they ordered the integration of the educational system. And, of course, that in the public school system, a lot of this was resisted by setting up these private academies that would avoid integration anyway. So it's not just at the university level and not just at Athens. It was a problem across the state and across the South. And by the way, not just in the North too. There's in the South too. There's also northern schools where people go to private schools to avoid integrated public schools. So
Mm.
so yes, it's a very, to me, part of the sadness about this and maybe the lesson about it is that people were not open to this, that the white community saw itself as a victim of federal overreach rather than being, kind of giving an opportunity to expand their world, to think more about, Georgia in black and white, not just white Georgia. And
Mm.
it's kind of it's a sad thing. And again, if you apply it to athletics, to music, to history, to academia, intellectually, this is opening a new world to people, right? And also, I think that the faculty is going to improve because you're going to get people who might not have wanted to go to a parochial institution, who are more open to saying, "Wow, this education, this university is now beginning to open itself up to the rest of the world, so I can teach there." So from my perspective, it was really something that paved the way for the university to become, a really great university. And it couldn't have done that under the old system, but the students didn't realize that. And so again, as you were saying, they saw themselves as the victim. And so I think that's still there in Georgia political culture and a lot of Southern political culture and some in American political culture. Like we are being pressured to do things to be a more multicultural, inclusive, diverse society. Diversity, equity, and inclusion those are now pejorative terms in the way that the Trump administration is behaving. And I think that's a kind of a modern day version of this. That not to say there aren't problems with the DEI programs, but the way it's talked about, I think just really is chilling to me because it really reminds me of what what the educational system and the political assumptions and cultural and racial assumptions that we saw in this period that I spent so much time studying.
And the second half of your book really is not to tell our listeners is this is not just about what happened in 1961, but the way that it has been remembered and commemorated across time, across the decades after 1961. And I want to talk about that, but first, I want to talk about your experience teaching at the University of Georgia in the mid 1990s, so roughly 35 years after the events that you've described. You yourself did a little experiment in that you asked your own students to write an essay, as Professor Brahana had done, about their experience at Georgia as concerns race. And I thought that was one of the most interesting chapters because you it's one of those sort of the more things change, the more they stay the same a little bit. So talk to us about what you found when you did that, and you may continue to do this to this day where you are at NYU, but you write specifically about what you did at UGA.
Right. Well, what happened was I had them in the class read the Georgia Historical Quarterly article that I wrote that later on became a chapter in
Mm-hmm.
this about what those white students said back in 1961, and they read about the riot and all that. And so I asked them, what had changed since then? What was the same? Did you think the university was a different place than it was then? And a lot of them, found it embarrassing, although, this could be their parents or uncles or aunts that were here. So they had a kind of it was very intimate to them. It was something that many of them were thinking about, but they never, by the way, one thing you saw was that the students almost never talked about race in any of their other classes. That's one of the things that was clear.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing was that part of the assignment was, I don't want you to just write about what you think. If you're white, I want you to ask a black classmate of yours, or vice versa. If you're black, I want you to a white classmate of yours, right? And so a lot of them would say, oh, what these white students were writing in those Brahana essays in 61 were really ignorant and awful. It's embarrassing that they could have this belief in white supremacy. But then when the part of the essay asked them to talk about what somebody from a different racial background, the black students thought if you're white, they didn't know anybody. Most of them could not find someone because the university was sort of still internally segregated. Not by law, not by, the university administration wasn't, but that was still the tradition in Georgia. And so they had nobody to talk to about it. And so what you found was that, and many of them hadn't thought about it, because the black population is so small, even to this day, only like what, something like 7% of the student population isn't. So you can go into classes and have almost no black students in the class. And so they didn't even realize this, that they didn't have any black friends or anybody they felt they could, this is kind of a touchy subject. So it's better to share it with somebody who you know. And some of them didn't know anybody who was black. And so it was kind of it's just revealing that the tensions were still there. The kind of color line informally was still there. And so much so that the students had never even thought it was, they didn't even know it was a problem. They hadn't thought about it because it was still conceiving of Georgia as essentially a white institution. And so the students were, but I don't want to put them down. Some of them were really, open to rethinking this. Some of them, some were defensive, but many of the students saw that this was a problem, this is a failure, this is continuing, this issue has not been resolved. That even though there aren't riots anymore, and there's not overt racism, there's internal segregation, and there isn't enough interaction with people socially. That see, people would say, like, I've been here, like the black students say, I've been here for 3 years. I've never been invited to a party by my white friends. And the fraternities and sororities are still segregated. So that was another, and those students tended to be the most, I don't know, I guess I'd say the most reluctant to acknowledge this problem. And so um, I just thought the university itself had still not been, it's sort of touchy. Let's not go there. Let's not talk about this. So there wasn't much discussion about it. And these essays really revealed that students, first of all, had important things to say, because some came from either segregated backgrounds or backgrounds where the schools that they've been in that were integrated had also had administrators that were hands off, that weren't doing anything to promote good interracial relationships. And so it just seemed like not to just single out University of Georgia, but the educational experience of a lot of these students pre-college had been similar, that nobody was really talking about, how do you forge interracial friendships? How should you think about, racial inclusivity? It just really wasn't something that they had been educated in. So I don't want to say it's not the same as Jim Crow, Georgia, but there is
Mhm.
that sort of thread of continuity where you would think that being in a multiracial society like Georgia, you would have, some, almost by the time kids got to college, they should be really experts in thinking about these issues. But as you could see in the essays, it wasn't the case with most of them. And so, and some of the students that the white students that did talk to black students, they were shocked that Georgia students, they had no idea what was it like to be a black student in this sea of white students, right? And there's so few black faculty. They had not, many of them had not thought about that. In fact, there's some resentment of, like, are they here because they got in because of affirmative action? They're not qualified. And so that was sort of in a way, another barrier to understanding or dialogue. And so, and again, it's not just UGA, it's a national problem, but as we see with the Trump administration. But I think what the essays really showed was that, there just wasn't a lot of educational intervention to try to promote understanding or knowledge between white and black students. And that's still, in a way, what's happened is the issues have kind of gone underground. That's more private. And so you won't often see overt public expressions of racism, but you see this sort of mostly, de facto segregation going on, and nobody really feeling in the administration that it's my job to do something about that. And by the way, one other thing that came out was that there's a story about a black student who I think it was in Rutgers, had been in this fraternity that was interracial. And the chapter at Georgia, he thought was the same way. So he applied, he was going to go in. And then he was shocked at the kind of unfriendly reception he got. And so he didn't join, but his black friends in Georgia thought, well, you're crazy. Why would you apply to begin with? Like, in other words, just seeing that the groups had kind of given up on the idea that they could, sleep under the same roof, right? And so that's, again, a kind of part of this overall. It's not just about the curriculum, right? It's also the social life, the extracurriculum. How are we interacting with each other? And who is trying to promote dialogue? And so I think my class was not saying it's like a therapy session for people, but it was revealing that, there really wasn't enough thought about that. And you would think that with the history that you have at Georgia, that people would be more thoughtful about this than many other places, because it's the South had been the place where there was this Black freedom movement that MLK and others had led, SNCC, and so in a way, and it is true that some whites who'd been affected by that were much better on race than, much more progressive on race than most Northerners were. So it's not to say this is totally this regional impossibility. It's not. It's just that that ethos had not really been, kind of assimilated into the educational system, on the social life of the university.
Hmm. And as I mentioned, you spend a good bit of time talking about the ways in which the university remembered these historic events, and it began, I think, in 1988 when the university, for the very first time, invited an African American to speak at commencement, and that, of course, was Charlene Hunter Galt. And she noted that there had been, quite frankly, not very much progress in the percentage of black students on the campus, which I know that the university had struggled with and continues to, as a lot of universities do to this day. But the really big moment, I think, was in 2001. 40 years after the events that you described in 1961, and you talk about how that was really probably the one that was the most impactful long term. The university has also remembered the 50th in 2011 and 60 in 2021. But talk about that 2001 commemoration, what made it so unique, and what were they trying to do?
Well, I think that that was the one where Governor Vandiver had been there and former Governor Sanders. They were basically trying to. It was dramatic because the governor apologized because when he ran for office, and he was the governor when the university integrated, but he
Hmm.
had saying no, not one, that there wouldn't be one black student going to school with white students in the university while he was governor, if he became governor, and he apologized for that. And so that was, a pretty dramatic moment. And I think that was a kind of an important moment. But still, and by the way, a lot of the commemorations celebrate the heroism of Charlene and Hamilton, and now Mary Frances Early, who was the first black graduate student, for crossing the color line. But what they don't do is really talk about the kind of things we've been talking about, like why did it take courage to do it?
Hmm.
And there's a poster that was used at one of the commemorations that had Charlene and Hamilton in the car, and they airbrushed out the crowd that was, basically really unfriendly of white students. And that to me was sort of symbolic of we don't want to talk about that, right? So essentially, I mean, look, it's very good and very positive that there are scholarships, there's buildings, there's a lecture series that honored the first black students. I mean, this is all really good, but we never really incorporated into the commemorations this idea of like how had the university failed for all those years, for all those decades. And by the way, you can even go back further. We haven't really talked about the pre-Jim Crow era, where the university was a center of pro-slavery thought, right back in the antebellum period. But I just think there hasn't been that kind of reckoning. And again, it's also true nationally. So I don't mean just pick on Georgia, but it's striking here that you can have a commemoration where you're celebrating the courage of the black students, but not the problem of racism and segregationism, Jim Crowism, that made it necessary to be courageous to come to school here, right? So I think that's the real problem that we have as a culture, not just Georgia, but nationally, is that, this is kind of put down as wokeism, political correctness, right? It's sort of seen as like, oh, it's like you're going on an apology tour. But it's not that. It's trying to understand our history and why it generated such unfairness and how it's still been really difficult to kind of come to grips with that and to make compensation for that. Like to this day, the student population of Georgia is much lower, like it's about 7%, whereas the black population of the state is almost over 30%. And the statistics are even lower with the black faculty. And of course, Georgia has never had an African American president. And so what I'm saying is that, there's a way in which this problem of not really being willing to reflect on this legacy of failure and discrimination has been disabling. That we're not going to get to more equitable situation as long as we don't come. Now, again, the fact that Vandiver apologized, I think that's significant. Although there are other things that he didn't apologize for, like opposing MLK in Albany, the Albany movement. There's a little more than just this one issue. right? And I'd say the same thing with Sanders, that he was more progressive. But on the other hand, when Charlene and Walter Stovall got married across interracial lines, he called that disgraceful back in '63. So, to me, it's like, well, it's better than not being apologetic at all, but it doesn't really go as far as it needs to be. And also, I would also say that if you're going to apologize, it shouldn't just be for that, that racist thing like no, not one, but also your failure. I mean, by the way, he did, Vandiver tried to take credit, and it's not that he shouldn't get the credit for being willing to avoid massive resistance and close the university rather than integrate it. So that's good. And he wanted to take credit for that. And I don't, okay, it's go give him credit for that. But the rhetoric he used when he was doing it was still like we were talking about before. I've been forced to do this, right? The feds have done this, right? Criticizing the courts when really I think the court should be praised for that, for bringing about equality before the law and opening the door to Georgia becoming a great interracial inclusive university. So to me, if there's an apology, it should be about not being able to articulate that. And by the way, not just in 1961, but still in retrospect, you haven't seen the Georgia political elite never did that. Talmadge, and then they did begin to appeal for the black vote. I'm not saying they did drop the Jim Crowism, but they never came back to saying that had been wrong. I had been wrong. That we need to really rethink the way that we do politics and educational in this place and get over this resentment. So that to me is sort of the problem, what's missing in these commemorations. But I'm glad that there are commemorations, and it's still it's major progress, but it's still not to me facing our history in the way that would be really liberating if we could.
Yeah, and I want to end by talking about that point because you begin your book by really talking about this. We know that there are plenty of people and places all around the country today who, as you pointed out, and we see it here at the Georgia Historical Society, who resist having continued conversations about not just Jim Crow and not just civil rights, but slavery, right? There's this sense among white populations that we will never heal the racial divide if we keep bringing up the unpleasant parts of our past, right? That and usually that means a white audience, we need to move past this. We'd stop talking about this. And as you said, this is our history. You also make a very eloquent plea, I think, at the beginning of the book and talking about why it's important. It is painful, yes, to remember these things and to talk about them, but it's necessary. What do you, Robert Cohen, say to the audiences who say we need to stop talking about this because it's unhelpful?
Well, I had this experience. Again, it's not just a Southern thing. I had this experience in at NYU with a parent. I'll tell you the story. I worked at Berkeley with Leon Litwack, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, and he wrote a book called How Free is Free. And I was chair of my department. And it's kind of these lectures he gave at Harvard on the history of racism. And as a gift to the best students in the ones we're giving awards to, I had Leon sign that little book, right, and give them copies, which I thought was really, kind of a beautiful thing that he did for them. And afterwards, I had this parent from suburban Long Island, his father, come up to me. Why do you have to have a book like this at a time like this? It's so negative. You're just like harping on the failures of the past. And what I said to him is, look, unless we understand these problems of the past, we're never going to overcome them. And what you're saying to me is like telling a cancer researcher that he or she is causing cancer. No, they're trying to understand it so they can help us to cure it. And it's the same thing here, that it's not like this guilt tripping. It's trying to understand, like, how is that kind of oppression possible? And how can we understand the damage that it's done and think about ways that we could compensate and overcome it? So I just think that whole notion that studying the Jim Crow past or the history of slavery is putting salt on people's wounds is exactly backwards. Like a physician, when they examine you and see you have an illness, that they want you to figure out how do we cure it, not how do we avoid discussing it. Because there are people, think about, there are a lot of people who fear going to the doctor, and they think like, I'm better off if I don't go to the doctor. In physician, I'll be better, but actually it's the opposite, right? You don't go to a physician and get medicine for it. It's gonna get worse. So I think again, it's this fear that's really disabling. And then also it becomes linked to kind of political movement, right? That there are these sort of simplistic pejoratives that are used for those who want to honestly confront the past as saying we're woke, or we're looking for political correctness, or about apologies and guilt. And that's really not what's going on. That's really thinking we got to we got to reckon with our past if we want to be liberated from it, from its problems, from its failures. And so the point you're raising is really important. And I think that's one of the unfortunate legacies of this history I'm talking about, is that we've not been able to face it. And I think, by the way, the reception of the book in terms of the media kind of reflects that. I've tried to get some newspapers, some radios, to kind of like discuss it, and it's like radio silence. And by the way, it's not just true in the South; it's just nationally that I think the political impact of Trumpism, it makes it very, very difficult to discuss these issues. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons why I couldn't publish it in state. I had to actually publish it with a non-Georgia publisher. And so I think this is, and what's going on with the schools saying, well, you can't talk about race because it's divisive. Well, that's promoting ignorance. That's that same thing, like, in other words, don't talk about this because you might hurt my feelings. Well, if the students' feelings are hurt and you're a teacher, then you should talk to them. In other words, like, that doesn't mean you don't discuss something, right? It means that you have a dialogue about it. Why is this upsetting to you? And what can we learn from your feelings? And how can we move beyond that? So I just think that there's a way in which avoiding our history is not a good way of understanding it, or being able to eventually transcend it. But that's really what you're talking about, is a very powerful movement, is this resentment. And to me, it's very similar and continuous with the kind of resentment we saw when the university desegregated. That people feel like they're being compelled to do something that they don't think they should do, and that's something that's not helping them. You're bringing people who are unqualified to go to school with them, which is not true. To get into the university, you have to be a high school graduate, and you have to be close to the top of your class. And so, you're not going to be with people who are, think about those first students who are avoiding Charlene and Hamilton, what they missed by doing that, right? These are really gifted, interesting, just really remarkable people. And by avoiding them, you're avoiding something really that could enrich your life. So it's a kind of a fear of the unknown that's really disabling. And to make it into a political virtue by developing these pejoratives to put people down, like me who study this, is really sad to see. Now, the question is, how do we push back on that? And all I can say is just write it on as histories and hope that people can read it and are willing to think about it. But it's a real challenge in this political environment.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an important book. The title is Confronting Jim Crow, Race, Memory, and the University of Georgia in the 20th Century. It's published by the University of North Carolina Press. The author is Robert Cohen. Robert, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, and continued good luck with everything you're doing.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here, and thanks for your very stimulating questions and observations. Okay.
Thank you. My thanks to Robert Cohen for joining me on this podcast. You can find out more about his book at uncpress.org. The hardest working producer and engineer in show business, the producer of this podcast, as well as the czar of our Tallahassee office, is our very own and indispensable Brendan Cannonball Crellin. You can find our podcast anywhere you can find podcasts, including YouTube and YouTube Music. You can also find Off the Beaten Path on the podcast app on your phone, and I would ask you to please leave a review on the Apple Podcast app, which would be most appreciated. Be sure and like Off the Beaten Path on Facebook as well. Learn everything about the Georgia Historical Society at georgiahistory.com and the Georgia History Festival at georgiahistoryfestival.org. Please also visit the official Off the Beaten Path website at deatonpath.georgiahistory.com and check out my videos, my blog, and similar podcasts about great books and the authors who write them, like this one. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. As always, thank you for listening.